Senator Smalley here. Senator David here. Senator Schultz here. Senator Holt here.
The chair sees a quorum. The Senate will come to order. Senate will come to order. Members, it is the custom and tradition of the Senate that we begin our daily deliberations with a prayer. With us today, we have one of our own, Senator Shaw, to offer the invocation. Will our members and guests in the gallery please rise as you are able?
Would you bow with me? Our Father, who is in heaven, your name is holy, and may we give you the reverence and respect that you so richly deserve. May we seek to do your will upon this earth as your will is done in heaven. May you deliver us from temptation and from the evil one. And today, may the words of our mouth and the meditation of our heart and the attitudes of our life be pleasing and acceptable unto you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. We want to pause to thank you that we live in a free land where we can exercise our right to make a difference in the world in which we live. And we want to say, particularly today, thank you to those who have fought to give us that freedom. And I pray that you would help us to use that freedom to seek your will and what is best for our state rather than simply our own will. Father, this past week we were able to celebrate the resurrection of your Son. And we're so grateful that we serve a risen Savior, that he lives. And today we offer this prayer in the name of our living, risen Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you, Senator Shaw. Mr. Leader.
Mr. President, will you recognize Senator Stanislawski for an introduction?
Senator Stanislawski, you're recognized for an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Floor Leader. Members, if you would join me in welcoming America's greatest teachers in the nation, many of which are here today from across the great state of Oklahoma. If our teachers in the gallery and any students that you brought would please stand as we welcome you and thank you for being here today.
Senate will come to order. Mr. Leader.
Mr. President, members, I told you yesterday that there's going to be a lot of switching back and forth between regular and special session. The first bill which we will be taking up today, House Bill 1019XX, is actually in special session, so we will be recessing here momentarily regular session to reconvene it, and we will be switching back and forth because the bills reside in both regular and special. With that, Mr. President, I move the Senate stand in recess in regular session until the call of the chair.
Members, you have heard the motion. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Those opposed, nay. Ayes do have it. Motion carries and adopted. The regular session shall stand in recess to the call of the chair.
Friday, April 6, 2018, 25th legislative day of the second extraordinary session.
The 25th legislative day of the second extraordinary session of the 56th Oklahoma Legislature is hereby called to order. Mr. Floor Leader, you're recognized.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the roll call of the Senate in regular session today be considered the roll call of the Senate in extraordinary session.
Members, you have heard the unanimous consent request. Without objection, that will be the order. Mr. Leader.
Mr. President, will you please recognize Senator Thompson for explanation of House Bill 1019XX.
Senator Thompson, you're recognized to explain the provisions of House Bill 1019.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. Leader. Members, as we move forward on this, Many of you will remember that as we are looking later today at a proposal to repeal the hotel motel, we want another avenue stream moving forward, and that's what we're looking at this morning. Whenever we look at the Bill 1019 before you, the new law, the first section deals with definitions, and the definitions are important because up until this particular time, we've been collecting sales tax from just Amazon, and Amazon does a lot of business with other individuals that may be vendors that Amazon is marketing for them, and so kind of a third-party vendor, a number of other vendors out there, and so you'll see some definitions, whether that be a forum, where they're going to be participating, or in a marketplace facilitator, marketplace seller, even those that are referring. I do want to bring your attention to page 7, section E, that all of the tax reporting and the remitting of sales tax for not only Amazon but now the third-party vendors will fall in harmony with the section 1354 or 1402 of Title 68 of the Oklahoma statutes. Those are the items that are taxed. That is how we operate in the state, and so basically we're bringing the third-party vendors underneath our tax code if they're going to be there. So those things that are taxed, they'll be responsible for taxing. And also, if there is an exemption because of a entity such as maybe a school or a church or a 501c3 that would be exempt here, would also be exempt there. But you would also see that if that exemption is made on page 9, line 17 and following, that no sales tax or use tax was imposed or collected, that must also be notification sent to the Oklahoma Tax Commission that that sale was made, and it fits in the section of law that we've talked about before. The section 5 of the bill, again, defines your remote seller, and it gives the following: that a date that they must be able to respond in section A, that the act does not elect to collect or remit the act, and then it gives some of the stipulations there. A statement still has to be generated, a list by date and instructions on mailing, and a statement that the remote seller and the marketplace facilitator is required to submit that report. And then we also see in page 13 that we have a statement that the sales or use tax may be imposed upon the state on a transaction, and gives all of the bottom of the page, line 22 and following, the purchaser's name, the purchaser's billing address, and if different, the purchaser's last name that we can look at. Section 7 on page 15, members, is that if somebody does not comply with this new law, that it is a $20,000 or 20% fine of the total sales in Oklahoma during the previous 12 months, whichever is less, against the remote seller or a marketplace facilitator or a referrer that makes an election, and we talked about earlier in the bill. You'll also notice that a penalty can be individually assessed but only collected once a year by the tax commission. The latter part of the bill in section 9 is where that we are amending the way that our sales tax is distributed. And so you can look through section 9, page 17, of how that some of it is already amended. And so sales tax that we have today on line 18, 10 through 12, that 10.46% shall be paid to the state treasurer to be placed in the credit of the Education Revolving Fund of the State Department of Education. Remember, that's on all sales tax that we collect today, and so that amount goes into the 1017 fund that we're using for education. We have amended this bill, and the amendment that you would see would be on page 20. It is underlined, members, in lines 13 down through line 18, that prior to the apportionments that have been listed in the previous section. So how our sales tax is apportioned all the way throughout the state. So before we make any other apportionments of sales tax provided in this section, there shall be apportioned to the Education Reform Revolving Fund, 1017, of the State Department of Education, the following amounts in the following state fiscal years. Certified by the Oklahoma Tax Commission for FY19 is $19,600,000. FY 2020 and each year thereafter is $20,500,000. And with that, Mr. President, I move for advancement at the proper time. Yield for questions.
Members, that concludes explanation of House Bill 1019. Members, I want to advise the body that there have been items placed at the desk, and I hereby serve notice that I object to any unanimous consent request, and I further request a roll call vote on any all motions subject to a voice vote and all questions before the body pertaining to House Bill 1019 XX, and that's by Senator Burkeen. We are in the posture of questions. That is the next order of business. Will there be questions to the author? Will there be? Senator Duggar, you're recognized for a question. Senator Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. Floor Leader. Mr. President, as indicated earlier on page 20, it indicates that the money for this particular bill will be to provide additional support for education. That's what was just read a minute ago. I want to confirm that specifically, and that is my question. Is that correct, that that's where the money for this particular bill, if it is passed today, will end up?
Mr. President, I thank you for the question. Mr. President, if we look at the amended part of it, is that every time some sales tax is paid in the state of Oklahoma, it is apportioned in different areas. And members, I won't go back over and read all those areas where it's apportioned, but it's broken down even to the minutia. What this bill does, it says when sales tax in Oklahoma is paid this year, the first $19.6 million is going to go in the 1017 fund before any of those other apportionments are done. And every year thereafter, it's going to be $20,500,000 prior to any other apportionments into education and into the 1017 fund.
Further questions? Senator Bass, you're recognized for a question to Senator Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President, Mr. Floor Leader. Senator, I noticed that this bill is capped at $19,600,000. Can you tell us why it's capped at that number?
Thank you for the question. Mr. President, whenever we begin to look at this particular tax, we have no history in the state of Oklahoma for us to say we've done this before, so what do we think it's going to be there? We have been able to deal with some of our counterparts in Washington and Pennsylvania that have enacted laws which require a marketplace facilitator to report the sales of their third-party sellers into their state or elect to begin collecting and remitting the sales and use tax for the third party. We feel like if Oklahoma enacted that same legislation, and by a comparison of what's happened in Pennsylvania and in Washington, that we should be collecting the 19.6 and the 20 million. Mr. President, I also want to make clear if we don't do that, if we don't make that much off the third party as our estimate, this bill mandates from all sales taxes that we must put this year $19.6 million into it, and we must put $20.5 million into the 1017 fund before any of the other sales taxes in the state of Oklahoma is distributed to anyone else.
Further questions? Senator Bass, you're recognized for a follow-up question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator, so you're saying simply that you think only this money is only going to be $19,600,000. That's all it's going to make in 2019.
Mr. President, I thank you for the question. Mr. President, I am not a CPA nor a fiscal analyst, but we have those that we have been consulting with who have gone back, as I said a few moments ago, to Washington and Pennsylvania and used data from their tax commissions, their data from their collections, extrapolated that same data into the state of Oklahoma, comparing it to this online sales tax that we are now receiving, and that is the certified amount that the tax commission has given us.
Further questions? Senator Bass, you're recognized for a follow-up question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator, on line 9, on line 18, in 2020, you're going to give them an extra $900 million, almost $1 million.
Yes, sir.
900,000, sorry. So in 2 years, you think in the next year it's only going to make $1 million more, less than $1 million more. Is that what you're estimating?
Mr. President, I thank you for the question. Mr. President, on line 17 for FY 2019, that is an estimate, Mr. President, for 11 and a half months. And on line 18 for FY 20, that is the full 12 months.
Further questions? Senator Daniels, you're recognized for a question to Senator Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. Floor Leader. In addition to this amendment, which guarantees at least $20 million in each succeeding fiscal year, after that is apportioned, we still go back to the regulations as they currently exist, which have additional apportionments that go to the Education Revolving Fund, the Teacher Retirement Fund, the Historical Society, and the Department of Tourism. Is that correct?
Mr. President, I thank you for the question. Mr. President, you are absolutely correct.
Further questions? Are there further questions? Senator Burkeen, you're recognized for a question to the author.
Thank you, Mr. President. In regards to the $19 million that will be collected by the state of Oklahoma, where will that money derive from?
Mr. President, I thank you for the question. It will be derived from sales tax.
Senator Burkeen, you're recognized for a follow-up question.
Will the average Oklahoman, whether they have it remitted to point of sale or whether they are placed in a situation when they file their income taxes, will have to go through and have an understanding that they owe that after this, if this bill has become law, that burden is on the average Oklahoman shoulders, and that tax will be on the average Oklahoman shoulders. Is that not accurate?
Thank you, Mr. President, for the question. Mr. President, if we look at sales tax within the state of Oklahoma, if we have a brick and mortar building that we go today that you buy an item, you pay sales tax in the state of Oklahoma. Every citizen who does not have an exemption, every item that they buy for consumption, the state statute says you will pay sales tax. What we have happened is because of, Mr. President, a 1992 ruling between Quill and North Dakota. The Supreme Court ruled in 1992 that unless a business had a nexus within the state, that you could not require online sales tax to be remitted because they viewed that as taxation without representation of those businesses that are out of state. The Supreme Court has taken that back up as of last October. We hope to have a ruling in June that will certainly do the Fairness and Marketplace Act, is what we're talking about doing in Oklahoma. So, Mr. President, if a citizen of Oklahoma buys any item from a brick and mortar store, they pay sales tax. This just simply says if any citizen in Oklahoma buy something from an internet store, from a third party, they will pay the same sales tax that they would pay here in the state of Oklahoma.
Senator Burkeen, you're recognized for a follow-up question.
And I appreciate the fairness element. I think many of us agree with the fairness element. I just want to make sure I'm clear in understanding. Somewhat like an import tariff on goods coming into our country, this ultimately is going to be placed upon the shoulder of the average Oklahoman. Is that correct?
Mr. President, I thank you very much for the question. This has no comparison to a tariff that's going to come in. For instance, if you go down to the local dress shop or men's store and you buy a suit in the state of Oklahoma, you pay sales tax on it. What's happened is, instead of folks doing that and supporting that brick and mortar business, they find an online suit or an online dress, and that third party vendor, because they've been out of state, has not been collecting sales tax from them. And so, Mr. President, what's happened even in small towns where I'm from and large towns, we actually have some of our citizens going into dress shops and suits, trying on dresses and suits, taking pictures of the labels, and making sure they've got the right size, hang it back up, and then go home and get online and order that suit and save sales tax. And so this will be a Fairness and Marketplace Act.
Senator Burkeen, you're recognized for a follow-up question.
So I appreciate the fairness argument. I think the fairness argument has great validity. Is the solution found in raising the average working Oklahoman's tax burden, or is potentially the solution found in making sure that the retail store has more fairness by potentially lowering the rate, broadening the base, giving them the opportunity to be competitive, so that the solution may not be found in taxing the average Oklahoman more, but making sure that the business is competitive by us really doing the hard work up here of looking after waste, fraud, abuse, reforms in state government, doing what we can to reform state government and lower the sales tax burden on that has to be remitted to the state of Oklahoma at those local retail businesses.
President, I thank you for the question. What we're looking at in this particular area is, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, we have statutes of items that are purchased in Oklahoma that are taxable. This brings businesses who are doing business in Oklahoma, they do not have a brick and mortar store or a nexus, but they're doing business with our citizens into compliance with our tax code. This is not a new burden, because we are already charged as citizens of Oklahoma to pay tax on what the law allows us to tax. At the same time, Mr. President, if you are a 501c3 or if you have a sales tax exemption from the Oklahoma Tax Commission, then that goes with this bill as well. So if you're not paying taxes now for what you buy in Oklahoma, whether you're agriculture, whether you're a farmer, or whatever you're doing, wherever you have those sales tax exemptions, this bill honors those same exemptions even though they're buying from a third-party vendor.
You're recognized for a follow-up, Senator Burkeen.
I'm going to yield for now. I appreciate in your opening remarks you discussed wanting to advance at the proper time. I appreciate you walking over and having a conversation with me. You're aware of the amendments on the desk. My understanding is that you will be moving at the proper time, allowing those amendments to move forward. Is that correct?
Mr. President, I believe in this great nation. I believe in democracy, and I believe that we ought to hear amendments that have been filed on this floor. So, Mr. President, I'm looking forward to not only hearing those amendments, but debating vigorously against them.
Very well. There are other members who have questions. Senator Bice, you are recognized for a question.
Thank you, Mr. President. My question to the presenter is it accurate that every Oklahoman who purchases a product online that does not have sales tax automatically collected should be remitting that sales tax voluntarily to the state of Oklahoma?
Mr. President, I thank you for the question, and I think if we looked at our income tax returns, that there is a line on there for us to say how much we've been spending out of state online. And again, I'm not a CPA or a fiscal analyst, but I would think that number is probably pretty dwarfed to reality.
Senator Bice, you're recognized for a follow-up question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would it surprise you to know, Senator, that there are approximately 4% of Oklahomans that currently remit use tax on their income tax return at the end of the year?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. Not surprised.
Further questions? Senator Dahm, you're recognized for a question.
Thank you, Mr. President. For clarity, did I understand the presenter to say that this is based on a Supreme Court decision dealing with businesses that have a nexus in the state?
Thank you for the question. Mr. President, I was giving a history of the online sales tax and taking that back to 1992 and the Quill versus North Dakota that said if there is not a nexus within the state, then it's impossible for us to go back at that particular time and do a straight across the board online internet sales tax to be there. This bill that we have before us is going back to the marketplace facilitator. So we're not in violation of the Supreme Court ruling. We go back to the marketplace facilitator, and Amazon will be the biggest. Then we are saying you must collect the sales tax from the people who you're doing business with, and then you will be remitting back to the state of Oklahoma.
Senator Dahm, you're recognized for a follow-up question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for that clarity. Can you explain to me then, if we are not basing this on the nexus provision from that Supreme Court ruling, how does this comply with Article 1, Section 10.2 of the U.S. Constitution?
Mr. President, I do thank you for that. Again, when we go back in the first section of this, we are defining those definitions of who that we are asking to do tax with. Amazon's already remitting tax because they've chosen to do that. We have gone back to them and said, now then the people that you're doing business with, we want you to collect sales tax from them and be able to remit that back. And Mr. President, I believe if the Supreme Court rules in the favor, what we're doing here today would certainly be replaced with an updated Supreme Court ruling, but they all would be required to, maybe more stipulations on them whenever that happens.
Senator Dahm, you're recognized for a follow-up question.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm sure we all greatly anticipate and look forward to that future potential Supreme Court ruling. Are these items that are coming into the state of Oklahoma, are they generated in the state of Oklahoma, or are they imported into the state of Oklahoma?
Currently, by our tax code, if items are manufactured here in the state and then sold within the state, they are already required to pay sales tax. And so these are items that you may go and buy something, not only sales tax, but use tax that you're using in Oklahoma. And so that's out of state, third-party vendors, you buy it, you're using it here, pay sales tax here.
Senator Dahm, you're recognized for a follow-up question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Perhaps I wasn't clear in my question. Out of state, are you picking it up out of state, or is it being imported into state for your use in the state?
Thank you, Mr. President, for that question. Now, Mr. President, if I'm out of state and I'm traveling through Tennessee and I decide to stop and buy a CD at Cracker Barrel after I've had lunch, I will pay Tennessee sales tax on that. But after I get home and I say, boy, I wish I'd have bought that Glenn Campbell CD, and I get online and I buy that from a third-party vendor, that currently I would not pay sales tax.
Senator Dahm, you're recognized for a follow-up question.
Thank you, Mr. President. So these items are items that are being imported into the state for the use in the state of Oklahoma, the citizens of the state of Oklahoma, and therefore that is the reasoning for them paying this sales tax on those items that are imported into the state. Am I understanding it correctly?
Thank you, Mr. President, for the question. These are items that, as a citizen of the state of Oklahoma, that I have decided that I want to purchase from a third-party vendor, and that as a citizen now, I will be paying the same sales tax if I went down to a local store and bought it if they had it.
Senator Donham, you're recognized for a follow-up question.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm going to go back to one of my questions I asked before then. Since these items are being imported into the state of Oklahoma, according to Article 1, Section 10.2 of the U.S. Constitution, it says that no state shall, without the consent of Congress, lay any imposts or duties on imports or exports except what may be absolutely necessary for executing its inspection laws, and the net produce of all duties and imposts laid by any state on imports or exports shall be for the use of the Treasury of the United States, and such laws shall be subject to the revision and control of the Congress. So my question would be, has Congress consented to the state of Oklahoma laying an impost, a sales tax, whatever you want to call it, on the citizens of the state of Oklahoma for these imported items? Has Congress acted on that yet or not?
Thank you, Mr. President. What Congress has acted on are tariffs and import and export. So if our farmers here in the state of Oklahoma, their wheat crops, their cotton crops, and they decide that they want to export those out of state, we have that agreement where that takes place. At the same time, if I am a manufacturer here and I want to import goods for me to be able to produce, whether that be aluminum or steel from China, then that export or tariff is paid and that tax is paid, and then it comes in to the people who produce that product here, and when they sell that product, if they sell it to an entity that needs to pay sales tax, they'll pay sales tax on it. This bill does not address any of that. This bill addresses sales tax, not import, export tariffs.
Senator Bergstrom, you're recognized for a question. He waives. Senator Smalley, you're recognized for a question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Don't know who still buys CDs today, Mr. President, but appreciate that thought. On page 15 for the presenter, we have the commission shall assess a penalty of $20,000 or 20%. And in the spirit of the Supreme Court ruling, Mr. President, I'd be curious on how are we going to go through collecting that kind of penalty and fine from a remote seller.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, for the question. Mr. President, in the entirety of the bill, and it's 20 pages, it talks about the reporting that they must be doing with the Oklahoma Tax Commission if they are selling over $10,000 a year. If they sell less than $10,000, they don't have to report. This is not applicable. So the Tax Commission in Oklahoma will work on the compliance of these third-party vendors that are out there. And in reading the entirety of the bill, third-party vendors will be supplying to the Oklahoma Tax Commission their products that they're selling, the itemized of the name of the recipient, email addresses, and so there will be some sort of a follow-up that we'll be aware of these companies that they may be selling over $10,000 a year. Tax Commission will audit them. Whenever that they audit them, then they will be able to go ahead and collect the tax to be able to do that. Again, we are working through marketplace facilitators, and that's going to be through, in this one, in Oklahoma, the major one is Amazon. And so those records, and Amazon's already working with the Oklahoma Tax Commission, it's going to be very easy for the Tax Commission to work through Amazon to identify these third-party vendors.
Senator Smalley, you're recognized for a follow-up question.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you for that answer, Senator. It very much clarifies a lot of my questioning on that. However, I do understand that not this body, but the body across the rotunda created this to be an apportionment. We all understand that. This is going directly to education in the spirit of this week and in the spirit to fund education, or at least funding education in the right direction. However, if the Supreme Court ruling goes the opposite way, is there not a potential or a possibility that we could see a decrease in this in the future, therefore not allowing or requiring those remote sellers or third-party sellers to actually remit that sales tax?
Mr. President, I thank you for the question. If I've learned anything in the years that I have spent on this good earth, anything is possible. Now, whether that's probable or not is probably not going to happen. Whenever that we begin to look at the different states across the United States that are already doing this, the Supreme Court has not shut them down. They've not said that you're out of compliance. There has only been one lawsuit that we know of, and it was filed intentionally in South Dakota. They passed this last year to require all marketplace vendors to pay sales tax in direct contradiction of the Quill versus North Dakota of 1992. The South Dakota legislature, Mr. President, passed that. The South Dakota Supreme Court said what they passed, requiring all to be able to pay sales tax, was unconstitutional by the U.S. Constitution. Knowing that they were going to kick it out, they filed the appeals, and now before the Supreme Court, who said that they would hear it last October and be heard in June. What this bill does, it takes Amazon, who's already selling, picking up more business all the time. Now then, instead of just Amazon paying the sales tax, any third-party vendor that works with them will also remit to Amazon and will be remitted to us.
Senator Smalley, you recognize for a follow-up question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator. The art of the possible and the probable, the art of politics, I understand that. But however, we do have to consciously understand that in the future, even in this body today and in the future legislatures out there, that we have to understand that there is a possibility that this dedicated revenue stream has the potential of falling short from what the numbers state in this bill. Is that correct?
Thank you, Mr. President, for the question. Mr. President, if I go back and the question that was asked earlier from Senator Bass, it was talking about just the dollar figures that are there. If we look to page 20, line 13, we are dealing with a sales tax bill of all sales tax that's in the state of Oklahoma. This online sales tax, third-party vendor tax, will be one of those that will feed into the pool of sales tax we now have. What this bill says is that prior to the apportionments otherwise provided in this section, so if you go back to this, the section that we're amending, that is the apportionment of all sales tax that's collected in the state of Oklahoma. That's if you're down at whatever store you are, wherever you're buying, whatever sales tax you spend in Oklahoma, it's all apportioned where that sales tax goes. This bill says prior to any apportionment, we're going to give 19.6 this year and 20.5 next year into the 1017 fund. So if this entire thing is overturned by some court somewhere, this bill says we will still put 19.6 and 20 in the 1017 fund. If we don't collect a red dime of online sales tax, this bill says the very first apportionment of the sales tax in the state of Oklahoma will be 19.6 this year and 20.5 next year into the 1017 fund.
Senator Smalley, you recognize for a follow-up question.
Thank you, Mr. President. That'll be my final follow-up. And I appreciate your response, Senator. I appreciate that assurances, and I appreciate your stance on ensuring that we're going to fund education regardless of the bill that we possibly are passing here today. But wouldn't this definitely be a move in the right direction for this body to sincerely take up apportionment reform so the members of this body, the members of the body across the rotunda, are held accountable to the people of Oklahoma whether or not we fund education or not, and put in the priorities that we were elected to put in? Would this movement today not show that apportionment reform is very much needed for us to do our job?
Thank you, Mr. President, for the question. Our Honorable Pro Tem carried legislation this last year as we have begun the process of apportionment reform, and I anticipate that our newly elected Pro Tem will continue that same priority and mandate.
Senator Griffin, you're recognized. She waves. Senator Pugh, you're recognized for a question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. Leader. Mr. President, is it true that municipalities are solely funded on sales tax in the state of Oklahoma?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. Yes.
Senator Pugh, you're recognized for a follow-up question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. Leader. And Mr. Leader, Mr. President, is it true that we are the only state in the country that funds municipalities in that manner?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. I'm not qualified to answer that. I've not studied all of the revenue streams for all 50 states. I know that we are unique in how that we fund our local cities. I know that the great state of Texas to the south funds some of their ad valorem that runs into that, as well as up to the state itself. But I'm sorry, Mr. President, I just don't have the knowledge to speak to all 50 states.
Senator Pugh, you're recognized for a follow-up question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I'm going to ask you to agree with me in acknowledging, isn't it true that we are the only state in the country that funds municipalities in that manner?
Mr. President, I agree with the good senator from Edmond that he said that we are the only state in the country that does it in this manner.
Senator Pugh, you're recognized for a follow-up question.
Thank you, Mr. President. And Mr. President, would you agree then that in addition to the revenue measures that we have been undertaking for the entirety, really, of my time in this position, which is just a little over 15 months, and I'm aging rapidly by the day, that we also need to take up some structural reforms to our state, just like being the only state in the country that funds municipalities in that manner?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. I am very much in favor of tax reform in the state. Mr. President, back toward the end of the late 60s, we were able to tax about 68% of our consumable goods. We're down now between 32 and 33% of our consumable goods, and our inability, because of State Question 640, to do some tax reform. We have about $1.4 billion of service taxes and other taxes that touch up against the borders of the state of Oklahoma that we've not been able to reform and bring some of that revenue in. I do know, Mr. President, because of sales tax funding our cities, a lot of our small cities, their infrastructure is in danger. Their infrastructure is in trouble. Their water plants are in trouble because their sales tax has diminished. And Mr. President, it's my firm belief as we work more with internet sales tax, and especially third market sales tax, it's not only going to help the state of Oklahoma as we try to fill our budget hole, it's going to help every small community and town across this great state of Oklahoma.
Senator Pugh, you're recognized for a follow-up question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, is this particular measure a part of that tax reform and structural reform?
Thank you for the question. Mr. President, I think it's a positive step in the right direction in that reform.
Senator Pugh, you're recognized for a follow-up question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, are small business owners taxpayers as well?
Thank you, Mr. President, for the question. Mr. President, they are taxpayers on the consumables that they buy. Just for clarity, if you've got a small business owner who buys goods to sell, they're not double taxed on it. They buy it a non-tax, and then whenever they sell it, they collect the tax. But those business owners in the state, any time that they go to any business to buy, they do pay sales tax themselves.
Senator Pugh, you're recognized for a follow-up question.
Thank you, Mr. President. And Mr. President, would you agree that by protecting small business owners who are also taxpayers and making sure that tax policy is fair and tax policy is equitable so that our small business owners, which fund our small communities through sales tax, the only way our small communities are funded in the state of Oklahoma. Heck, I don't live in a small community. I live in Edmond, one of the largest communities in the state and continuing to be the fastest growing community in the state, and we're only funded as a large community through sales tax. Would you agree that by making sure that our tax policy is fair and equitable so that our small businesses can be competitive with online out-of-state companies, that is also protecting the taxpayers of Oklahoma?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. Yes, I would agree.
Further question. Senator Peterson, you're recognized for a question. He waves. Further questions. Senator Bass, you're recognized for a question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator, this is my last question, but any funds left over after the $19 million goes in the general revenue fund, is that correct?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. This particular bill is a bill about all of our sales tax the sales tax that goes into the education revolving fund. Mr. President, what this bill does, it says before we do any of those apportionments, before there's that 85% that gets into the general revenue fund, the first $20.5 million that we collect every year will go into the 17 fund. And Mr. President, if I make an illustration, it's kind of like our roads fund. We pay $575 million a year. When people pay their income tax, the first $575 million goes right into the roads fund. It doesn't even go into the apportionment chart. It just goes straight to roads. This is similar, Mr. President, that the first $20.5 million of sales tax paid by the citizens of Oklahoma, whether it's the marketplace outside the state or the marketplace inside the state, will go into the 1017 fund.
Senator Bass, you're recognized for a follow-up question.
Apologize about that. So the Oklahoma Tourism Promotional Revolving Fund has an opportunity to receive some money, as well as the Oklahoma Tourism Capital Improvement Revolving Fund.
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. Excellent question. You'll notice on page 19 of the bill and line 12, we have, let's go back up to the top of the page, Mr. President. I apologize. Out of the apportionments of all of the taxes, we've got 0.87, that's 87 hundredths, are paid to the state treasurer. Out of that 87 hundredths, line 12 then, 64% of that 87 hundredths goes into the Tourism Capital Improvement Revolving Fund, but it is also capped at what we spent in 2015. So anything over that would go back into the General Revenue Fund.
For another final follow-up, Senator Bass, you're recognized.
Sorry about that. What was I going to say, Senator? I guess I'll pass.
He waves. Senator David, you're recognized for a question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, just for bringing this back into clarity on market fairness, when we're talking about these apportionments in this bill, Mr. President, we are still only talking about the state portion of sales tax. Is that not correct, which is 4.5%?
Correct. Thank you for the question, Mr. President. That is correct.
Senator David, you're recognized for a follow-up question.
So the rest of the sales tax that is collected on these sales goes to the zip code of the purchaser. Is that not correct?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. That is correct.
Senator David, you're recognized for a follow-up question.
Thank you, Mr. President. So this not only helps our schools and the state of Oklahoma and the other areas that the sales tax is apportioned to, but it also helps all of our local communities. And I, as a small town person, because I'm not from Edmond, Oklahoma, my sales or my mailing address is actually Porter, and our only sales tax base physically currently is a small convenience store and a gas station. So every dollar that I spend on Amazon that will now be collected through Amazon or through third party actually helps even my small town community. Is that not correct?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. It's absolutely correct. Small towns, because of the inability to collect sales tax, seem to be getting smaller and smaller in the impact that they make there. Mr. President, it's in my humble opinion that too many people are moving and shopping in Edmond.
Okay. Senate will come to order. Further questions on the bill? Senator Fry. Senate will come to order. Senator Fry, you're recognized for a question.
Thank you, Mr. President. As a former mayor, and I watched sales tax on the internet purchases grow in my community, and we lost 16, or I think maybe the first time we started looking at data, and it's grown to 28% purchases. We've had to increase sales tax in my community in order for us to maintain our police and fire. Would you agree that I may not have to raise taxes in my local community if we're able to collect the taxes that are available to us under our present laws?
Thank you, Mr. President. The gentleman from Midwest City makes a very valid point. We've had, because the inability to have a Fairness in Marketplace Act, we've actually had to impose a higher sales tax on our citizens just to keep our infrastructure, our police, and our fire working.
Further questions? Senator Peterson, you're recognized for a question to Senator Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think this question has actually been answered, but I just wanted to hear it one more time from the presenter. Do you think that this will make more competition, more competitive, on an equal playing field with the online vendors if this is passed?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. I made a statement early on, and it's certainly not a fabrication. A lot of business owners have talked to me that citizens now come in, try on shoes, try on clothes, make sure they get the right size, make sure they get the right label, and then they go and order that off of the internet. and the local business loses the revenue, even though they're the showroom for the internet stores. And but then we are not collecting the sales tax. And so, Mr. President, I believe with all my heart, if we pass this, this is truly a Fairness and Marketplace Act.
Further questions? Further questions to Senator Thompson? Seeing no further questions under Senate Rule 822C, the proper order of business is now consideration of amendments. There are amendments at the desk. Clerk will read.
Amendment number 1, Mr. President, I move to amend House Bill number 1019XX by substituting the attached floor substitute for the title, enacting clause, and entire body of the measure as previously distributed by Senator Burkeen.
Senator Burkeen, you're recognized to explain your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, this amendment is supplanting what's in the bill, moving to the direction that I think is a better policy for the state of Oklahoma. The amendment before you would, instead of placing a higher tax burden on the average Oklahoman, it would go after preferential treatment of a few at the expense of the many in Oklahoma. The amendment on the desk is in relation to the zero emissions tax credit that the wind industry enjoys. That industry this year will not pay a dime in income taxes. That industry will receive a check in the mail of $70 million of collected taxpayer monies. Why I'm offering it on this bill? I believe it's better policy. I think that there's a fairness argument in 1019 that has merit. But my plight is, before we ask the taxpayer for another dollar, why are we not addressing preferential treatment at the expense of the many Oklahomans? And so I want to read through some statistics. It's an opportunity here. Most people are unaware of the 135 business-related tax credits, the $70 million check and mail cash payment that we pay to zero emissions that goes mostly to out-of-state shareholders' ownership. It is a refundable tax credit. Most tax credits offset your income tax liability. A refundable tax credit, of which there's only 2 of them in the state of Oklahoma left, is zero emissions. We drive down your income tax liability to absolutely nothing. By the way, the last taxable information says it was $3 million because of other things that we've dealt with over the years. They had a $3 million taxable liability. We offset that, and after they paid not a penny in income taxes, we cut them a check in the mail. We are on the hook for $500 to $750 million over the next 10 years. I just got off a conversation with the Tax Commission this morning. That is an estimate I was given. Between $500 million to $700 million is what this body is going to be on the hook for. So I, Mr. President, respectfully ask that we look at this amendment. We give it due diligence. I ask that we vet it. And I'm going to close with this in my lengthy introduction. This scenario at the Capitol reminds me of the 1930s movie Wizard of Oz. So remember in that movie, Dorothy and her friends have come to the Capitol seat, the House of Power. And they're there, and they're looking, and they hear this booming voice that says, "Do not invoke the wrath of the Wizard of Oz, the great Oz." And Dorothy responds and says, "If you were really great, you would keep your promises." And then the little dog goes over and pulls the curtain back, and you see a little man spinning wheels, pulling levers, and all of a sudden, the gig's up. It's been exposed. And the booming voice, the thundering, the billowing cloud says, "Never mind the guy behind the curtain." Members, why has this bill not been out here? Why do I have to go and amend a Title 68 bill to get this bill on the floor? Why has the bottleneck been out here? Because we continue this process of preferring a few at the expense of the many. Why are some of you upset that I had to go this route? It's because we are not allowed to get this type of measure on the floor, and Oklahomans are kept in the dark. This is the man behind the curtain. This is the special interest. It's time to deal with it.
Members, that concludes explanation of the amendment. Will there be questions on the amendment? Senator Thompson, you are recognized for a question on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, it's my understanding
that if this amendment were to prevail and pass this floor today, that it would do away with the entirety of the Marketplace Fairness Act that we've just been discussing for the last hour?
That is correct, Mr. President, but let me give you payout. $70 million is what we'll pay out this year. $500 to $750 million is our next 10 years of payments. Yes, we put them in July 1 of 2017 at a standstill, but we said that you're going to have a 10-year window where we're going to continue to do corporate welfare for you, issue you a refundable tax credit. And so when you compare the $20 million, approximately $20 million that you're talking about, that's not even a certain number, that we don't even know if we're going to collect, and we're going to have to go back and make sure we can pull funds elsewhere to make sure we can meet that promise. What we do know is this long term for the health of our state is stealing from the taxpayer. It is not just, it is not fair, and we need to address it. And so if you look at the $20 million, by year 3 of this, we know by talking to the Tax Commission, we're somewhere between 70 and 100 million on the hook for this year because we're 2 years behind on what tax receipt information. And so the measure before us that would have taxed the average Oklahoman, yes, it would have brought in revenue. Maybe the fairness issue has validity, but this one is fourfold the monies to be able to fund core government.
Senator Thompson, you're recognized for a follow-up question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, do we currently have any of the incentives for WIN still active on the books, or have they all been closed down? They've all been sunsetted? Mr. President, I'm just wondering.
Thank you, Mr. President, for the question. We've had 6 changes since 2001 WIN tax credits. In fact, let me give you, to quote my good friend Senator Quinn, it's odd to see where it wasn't to the benefit of the wind industry. What you'll see is if you look at the actual time period, in 2001 we went from a set it in at a 0.75% of a cent per kilowatt hour generated, and then it kicked in from 07 to 2012. We brought it back down to 0.25. For those of us that know that Governor Keating's gone on record saying that he was told it would cost $2 million to the state of Oklahoma. We know it's in the $100 million range now in totality. What happened in 2001, it was supposed to be sunset in 2012. We came back in 2002. We came back in 2006. In 2006, modified the type of facility which qualified, added new category of credit facilities, and then bumped the sunset date to 2016. We're going to continue this and increase the credit back to 0.5% for every kilowatt hour produced. Then we came back in 2013 and we extended it again to 2021. You see a pattern. It's continuously been to help the little man behind the curtain, the special interest who is getting into the ears of elected officials. And the obvious solution should have been kept the promise, the original promise. But we didn't keep the original promise. We modified to the benefit of the special interest.
Senator Thompson, you're recognized for a follow-up question on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the gentleman from Colgate alluded to a number of times that we have amended the current statute. Mr. President, I just wonder if the gentleman from Colgate would affirm that the legislature voted each of those times and the governor signed each of those times for it to take place.
Mr. President, I would concur, but very few people on this floor struck hands in a pledge. Most of these votes predate you. It's easy to say you made a promise, you have to keep it. Let me ask you something. I did not vote for the 2% GPT in 2014 because I thought, and I said on this floor, it was going to steal opportunity to lower the rate and broaden the base for the average Oklahoman, that not all taxes are fair, that when you have an opportunity to cut taxes, you cut taxes for the working individuals, of which oil and gas are part of that. And my statements on that floor were, we need to not be preferential in the way we do tax cuts. We need to have a low rate broad base for everyone. I mentioned that to say some on this floor voted for that. Some weren't here. And so in this alluding to we need to keep our promises, I didn't vote for the package that went to 5% last week. It was packaged together to raise taxes on the average Oklahoman. Many of us asked for a standalone vote. What happens? We get these measures bottled up. They're never allowed on this floor. What I'm doing right now, some of you may consider grandstanding, but I will tell you, this is the fight after 8 years that I am tired of asking and petitioning. Let the people know what's really going on up here and expose. We never let these conversations get to the floor. And so for those that say, well, keep the promise to win, what about those of you that didn't keep the promise that you voted for on the 2% of GPT? Did you keep your promise to GPT? You were more than happy to change your promise to them. So I'm making the point, the promise I'm going to keep is to the average Oklahoman to make sure that their rate, and they pay a fair rate, and that we're not preferring a few at their expense.
Senator Thompson, you're recognized for a follow-up question.
Thank you, Mr. President. On the amendment, Mr. President, the gentleman from Colgate made mention that many of us on the floor were not here when some of those other things were passed. But, Mr. President, is it not true that this floor passed last year to move the sunset up from 2022 or 2021 to 2018, and that we sunsetted last year by members on this floor by a majority vote in the House and in the Senate, and the governor signed it, to sunset and end the zero emission incentive as of July 1 of last year?
Mr. President, that was the best opportunity that this body was given a chance to vote on, because it was never allowed to come to the floor to be able to address it in totality. That's the bottlenecking that occurs. That's the super legislator status that occurs up here. Decisions of super legislators. I didn't take the path of leadership. I'm going to finish, Mr. President. I didn't take the path of leadership. Leadership doesn't necessarily mean having a chairmanship next to your name. Leadership says, I'm going to do what I think is right. And some of us get controlled by the men behind the wheels, pulling the levers and spinning wheels. And we compromise in the moment so we can get the chairmanships. And so what happens is we think, well, we'll justify. In the future, I'll do better things. And it's a mirage. And once you go down the path of compromise, then we have the situation where we look after special interest at the expense of the average Oklahoman.
Majority Leader is recognized. Very well. Senator Thompson, do you have a follow-up question? You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I'd like to restate my question. Did this body last year sunset, as of July 1 last year, the zero emission tax credit?
You put a date of entrance, but for 10 years, what you didn't address is the $70 million corporate welfare payment we will make every year moving forward until it starts winding down in 2027. We will pay out $500 million, up to $750 million, according to the Tax Commission information I received as of late this morning. That we did not address.
Further questions? Senator Griffin, you're recognized for a question on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. President. Different line of questioning. I'm not going to ask you about taxes. I'm going to ask you about electric utilities. To Mr. President, what has been the impact of investment in our state on utility rates across our great state and also across the country?
Thank you, Mr. President, for the question. Let me refer to the Incentive Evaluation Commission, who said more or less that it's negligible. The Incentive Evaluation Commission, who reviewed that, what they said was because of the natural gas that is readily available in Oklahoma, it's negligible at 15% on our grid. And I can get you the exact citation of the Incentive Evaluation Commission that studied this in 2016.
You're recognized, Senator Griffin, for a follow-up question.
Follow-up. The Incentive Review Commission, is that a commission that was formed to study the utility industry in the country?
They were designed to look at this tax credit and its overall effect on Oklahoma.
Senator Griffin, you're recognized for a follow-up question.
Thank you. So that study was actually, am I correct in saying that it is a study on the effect of the tax credit, not the improvement, the increase of investment in wind energy on utility rates?
Mr. President, I will yield that there are other experts outside that was utilized in evaluating this. However, based upon the experts that have studied this, the only analysis that I'm aware of, they said it is negligible in terms of how it affects our rates because of the amount of natural gas, its low percentage on the grid, and its shipment out of state once it gets on the grid.
Senator Griffin, you're recognized for a follow-up question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, would the author be surprised to learn that there are actually numerous studies by utility industry experts that say that the growth of wind energy along with other renewable sources of electric utility create a scenario through competition that even as 90% of the coal-fired plants in this country are scheduled to go offline, that even with taking coal out of the mix and producing utilities, much to the dismay of some of our colleagues that have coal mining in their district, that we can actually expect that 20 years from now, utility rates and electric utility generation to cost less than it does today. Would that be of a surprise to the author, or is he aware of any of those studies?
I'm aware of the study that says that in terms of its overall impact on our grid, the incentive evaluation, which was a thorough analysis, that this body supported put into legislation to make sure we review any effect that any of these changes to tax credits would occur. They said it is negligible considering natural gas is a plentiful resource, and the fact that the small percentage of wind on our grid, and the fact, an additional factor, is that it is shipped out of state.
Senator Griffin, you're recognized for a follow-up question.
Thank you. One last question. Is the author aware that the electric utility industry is not contiguous within the borders of any state, and that all electric generation is actually put into pools that cross state lines?
Thank you, Mr. President. The gentlelady has actually helped me make a point that the $70 million corporate welfare payment we make every year is actually subsidizing the utility rates in other states.
Further questions, Senator Allen, you're recognized for a question to the author on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, is this what's the physical impact on this after what we do on this?
Thank you, Mr. President. It's $70 million once fully implemented. Because of the way they file their taxes, there's a 1.5-year delay. Once fully implemented, it's $70 million. That also factors into the $500 to $750 million that this state government will not be able to utilize